What if I told you that somewhere in your family's old photographs, there might be a face that was never supposed to be there? A person who never lived, never breathed, never existed, yet somehow found their way into your most precious memories. The Whitmore family discovered this impossible truth in the winter of 2019, when they inherited a leather-bound photograph album from their great-aunt's estate. What started as a nostalgic journey through family history became something far more sinister, because hidden among the sepia-toned faces of their ancestors was someone who, according to every record, every document, every living relative, had never been born. But that face knew things about the family that no stranger could possibly know. And as the Whitmores would soon discover, some photographs don't just capture moments in time. Sometimes they capture something else entirely. Our story begins on a cold December morning in Salem, Massachusetts. Margaret Whitmore had just finished sorting through the belongings of her great-aunt Cordelia, who had passed away at the remarkable age of 97. Cordelia had been the family historian, the keeper of memories, the one who preserved every letter, every trinket, every photograph that told the story of the Whitmore lineage. The old Victorian house where Cordelia had lived for 70 years was a museum of family history. Every room contained artifacts from different generations. China cabinets displayed delicate teacups that had belonged to great-grandmothers. Wooden trunks overflowed with letters tied in faded ribbons. And everywhere, covering every available surface, were photographs. Margaret had spent 3 days going through Cordelia's possessions, carefully sorting items into boxes marked Keep, Donate, and Research. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the emotional weight of each discovery. Every item seemed to carry the whispers of the past, the echoes of lives lived and stories told. The house itself seemed to hold memories in its very walls. As Margaret moved through the rooms, she could almost hear the conversations that had taken place there, the laughter and tears of generations of family gatherings. Cordelia had been meticulous in her preservation efforts, keeping detailed notes about the provenance of each item, the stories behind each photograph. Among the dusty boxes and moth-eaten quilts, Margaret found something that made her heart skip. A pristine leather album, its pages filled with photographs dating back to 1912. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each photo carefully mounted with corner tabs, accompanied by elegant handwritten captions in Cordelia's distinctive script. But this album was different from the others Margaret had found. While Cordelia's other photo collections were organized chronologically or by family branch, this album seemed to focus on a specific time period and a specific branch of the family tree. The photographs all dated from 1912 to 1913, and they all featured the same core group of people. The album's leather cover was worn smooth by decades of handling, suggesting that someone had looked through it many times over the years. The binding was still strong, the pages intact, but there was something about the way it had been stored that suggested it had been hidden away, kept separate from the other family photographs. Margaret called her brother David and her cousin Sarah. They agreed to meet that evening to go through the album together, to piece together the stories of relatives they'd only heard about in whispers and half-remembered tales. David arrived first, shaking snow from his coat as he entered Margaret's warm kitchen. He was a retired history professor, and his eyes lit up when he saw the album waiting on the table. At 68, David had spent his career studying the past, but family history had always held a special fascination for him. Sarah arrived shortly after, bringing coffee and pastries from the bakery where she worked. At 55, she was the youngest of the 3 cousins, but she had inherited Cordelia's eye for detail and her passion for preserving family stories. The 3 of them gathered in Margaret's living room as snow began to fall outside. The album felt heavy in their hands, weighted with more than just paper and memories. The leather cover was embossed with the initials CW in gold lettering that had faded but was still visible. CW, Sarah mused, tracing the letters with her finger. I wonder who that was. None of our direct ancestors had those initials. Margaret made a note to research the initials later. For now, she was eager to see what stories the photographs would tell. As they opened to the first page, they were transported back over a century. The photographs were remarkably well preserved, protected by the album's quality construction and Cordelia's careful storage. Each image was sharp and clear, capturing details that brought the past to life. There was their great-great-grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, standing proudly in front of the family's original homestead. He was a tall man with a stern expression, wearing a dark suit and a watch chain that caught the light. His posture spoke of confidence and prosperity, the bearing of a man who had built something substantial for his family. His wife Eleanor sat in a wooden chair beside him, her hands folded in her lap, wearing a dress with intricate lace detailing. Her expression was more reserved than her husband's, but there was intelligence in her eyes and a quiet strength in the way she held herself. Their children were arranged around them like flowers in a garden, each face serious and formal, as was customary for photographs of that era. The eldest son, Thomas Jr., stood behind his father's right shoulder, already showing signs of the man he would become. The daughters were arranged by age, their dresses carefully chosen to reflect the family's status. The photograph was labeled The Whitmore Family, Summer 1912, in Cordelia's careful handwriting. Below the main caption, in smaller text, were the names of each family member, their ages and their relationships to Thomas and Eleanor. They turned the pages slowly, reverently. Each photograph told a story. Birthday celebrations where children wore their finest clothes, and adults gathered around tables laden with food. Christmas mornings, with a tree decorated in the Victorian style, presents wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Summer picnics by the lake, where the women wore long dresses despite the heat and the men kept their jackets on, even while playing games with the children. The quality of the photographs was exceptional for the era. Someone in the family had clearly invested in good equipment and had the skill to use it properly. The lighting was carefully considered, the compositions thoughtfully arranged. These weren't casual snapshots, but carefully planned family portraits that were meant to preserve important moments for future generations. Margaret noticed that many of the photographs showed the same locations repeatedly. The front porch of the family home with its elaborate Victorian gingerbread trim, the parlor with its heavy furniture and formal arrangement, the garden, where Eleanor clearly took pride in her flower beds and vegetable plots. It was Sarah who first noticed something odd. In a photograph labeled Thomas's 50th birthday celebration, August 1912, there was a young woman standing at the edge of the group. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark hair pinned up in the Gibson girl style that was fashionable at the time. Her dress was well made, suggesting she came from a family of some means. But it was her eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They seemed to look directly at the camera with an intensity that was almost unsettling, as if she was trying to communicate something across the decades. "Who is that?" Sarah asked, pointing to the woman. Margaret squinted at the photograph, adjusting her reading glasses. "I'm not sure. Maybe a neighbor, or a friend of one of the daughters." The woman's presence in the photograph was puzzling. She wasn't positioned like a casual visitor or family friend. She was integrated into the group, standing between two confirmed family members, her posture suggesting she belonged there. But as they continued through the album, the woman appeared again, and again, in the background of a family picnic, standing beside a table laden with food, standing beside the Christmas tree, holding what appeared to be a gift, sitting at the far end of the table during what appeared to be a formal dinner, her place setting as elaborate as those of the confirmed family members. David frowned as he studied the images. "She's in a lot of these pictures for someone who's not family. Look at this one." He pointed to a photograph showing the family gathered on the front porch of their home. "She's not standing awkwardly at the edge like a visitor would. She's integrated into the group, right there between Eleanor and one of the daughters." The more they examined the photographs, the more questions arose. The mysterious woman wasn't just present at family gatherings. She seemed to be an integral part of the family's daily life. In one image, she was helping to serve food at what appeared to be a church social. In another, she was sitting in the family's parlor, reading a book while Eleanor worked on her embroidery nearby. In a particularly intimate photograph, she was helping one of the younger children with what appeared to be a school lesson. The two of them bent over a book together. The scene spoke of familiarity and affection, not the formal distance that would be expected between a child and a stranger. They decided to research. Margaret had spent years working on the family genealogy, and she had detailed records going back 5 generations. She pulled out her files, her charts, her carefully documented family tree that covered the dining room table when fully spread out. The genealogy work had been Margaret's passion project for over a decade. She had corresponded with distant relatives, visited courthouses and churches, and spent countless hours in libraries and archives. Her records were meticulous, cross-referenced, and verified through multiple sources. She had copies of birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, and census data. She had transcribed family letters and documented family stories passed down through generations. Her work had been recognized by the local genealogical society and had helped other families trace their own lineages. There was no record of any young woman matching the description. No cousin, no family friend, no hired help who would have been included in so many intimate family moments. Margaret's records showed that Thomas and Eleanor had 5 children, 3 daughters and 2 sons. The daughters were Mary, age 19 in 1912, Elizabeth, age 16, and young Catherine, age 12. The sons were Thomas Jr., age 22, and William, age 14. Maybe she was a boarder, Margaret suggested. It was common back then for families to take in lodgers to supplement their income. Taking in boarders was indeed a common practice in 1912, especially for families with large homes. The extra income could make the difference between comfort and financial struggle, but even that theory fell apart when they examined the photographs more closely. The woman wasn't dressed like hired help or a temporary resident. Her clothing was expensive, well-tailored, made from fabrics that suggested wealth and status. In several photos, she wore jewelry that appeared to match pieces worn by the confirmed family members. More disturbing was her positioning in the photographs. She wasn't standing awkwardly at the edges like an outsider might. She was integrated into the family groupings, sometimes with a hand resting on someone's shoulder, sometimes holding a family child. In one particularly unsettling image, she was seated next to Eleanor Whitmore, and the two women's poses mirrored each other so perfectly it was as if they were sisters. The body language in the photographs told a story of acceptance and familiarity. The mysterious woman didn't look uncomfortable or out of place. She looked like she belonged there, like she had every right to be part of these intimate family moments. David suggested they contact other family members. Surely someone would remember stories about this mysterious woman. They spent the next several days making phone calls and sending emails to elderly relatives scattered across the country. They called Margaret's great-uncle Harold, who was 93 and had an excellent memory for family stories. Harold had been born in 1926, so he would have been too young to remember the events of 1912 directly, but he had grown up hearing stories from older relatives who had been there. "I've never heard of anyone matching that description," Harold said when Margaret described the mysterious woman. "And believe me, I heard plenty of family stories growing up. My grandmother used to tell me about everyone who had ever lived in that house." They contacted second cousins in California who had inherited their own collections of family photographs. They reached out to relatives in Maine who had maintained correspondence with the Massachusetts branch of the family for decades. They even contacted the descendants of families who had been neighbors of the Whitmores in 1912. The responses were unanimous and chilling. No one had ever heard of such a person. No family stories mentioned a young woman living with or frequently visiting the Whitmores during that period. It was as if she had been completely erased from the family's collective memory. But she was there, in photograph after photograph, as real and solid as any other family member. Her presence was undeniable, documented in image after image, spanning what appeared to be several months or even years. Margaret decided to have the photographs examined by an expert. She contacted Dr. James Harrison, a professor of photography and digital imaging at a nearby university. Dr. Harrison specialized in historical photograph analysis and had worked with museums and archives to authenticate and restore vintage images. When Margaret called to explain her situation, Dr. Harrison was immediately intrigued. "Historical photograph mysteries are rare," he said. "Most questions about old family photos can be resolved through genealogical research. But what you're describing sounds genuinely puzzling." When Margaret showed him the album, Dr. Harrison's initial reaction was one of admiration. "These are remarkable," he said, adjusting his glasses as he studied the images. "The quality is exceptional for 1912. Whoever took these knew what they were doing." He explained that photography in 1912 was still a complex and expensive process. The equipment was heavy and cumbersome, the chemicals were dangerous to work with, and the exposure times were long enough that subjects had to remain perfectly still. The fact that these photographs were so clear and well composed suggested that someone in the family was either a skilled amateur photographer or had hired a professional for these sessions. The technical quality is consistent throughout, Dr. Harrison observed, examining the images with a magnifying glass. Same camera, same film stock, same developing techniques. This wasn't the work of multiple photographers. Someone was documenting this family's life very systematically. But when Margaret pointed out the mysterious woman and explained their dilemma, Dr. Harrison's expression changed. He spent the next hour examining each photograph with a magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the lighting, shadows, and grain patterns that might indicate manipulation or alteration. "I'd like to take these back to my lab," he said finally. "I want to run some tests." Margaret agreed, and Dr. Harrison carefully transported the album to his university laboratory. He promised to call with results within a few days. 3 days later, Dr. Harrison called with results that defied explanation. "I've examined these images with every tool at my disposal," he said, his voice tight with confusion. "Spectral analysis, pixel examination, comparison studies. If these photographs have been manipulated or altered in any way, it was done with technology that didn't exist in 1912, or today for that matter." He paused, and Margaret could hear him shuffling papers. "The woman you're asking about, she's not an addition to these photographs. She's not pasted in or superimposed. The grain patterns match perfectly across her image and the rest of the photograph. The lighting on her face is consistent with the lighting on the other subjects. The shadows fall correctly. According to every test I can run, she was physically present when these pictures were taken." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "But that's impossible. We have no record of her existence." "I know," Dr. Harrison replied quietly. "That's what makes this so disturbing. I've been analyzing photographs for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Either your family records are incomplete, or we're dealing with something that challenges everything we understand about historical documentation." Dr. Harrison went on to explain the specific tests he had conducted. He had used digital enhancement to examine the grain structure of the photographic emulsion, looking for signs that different images had been combined. He had analyzed the light sources in each photograph, checking to see if the mysterious woman was lit differently than the other subjects. He had even examined the chemical composition of the photographic paper to ensure that all parts of each image had been developed at the same time. "Every test confirms the same thing," he said. "These photographs are authentic, unaltered documents from 1912. The woman was there." The Whitmore siblings decided to dig deeper. They contacted the local historical society in the town where their ancestors had lived. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, was helpful, but ultimately unable to provide any additional information. "The Whitmore family was well documented," she explained over the phone. "They were prominent in the community. Thomas owned the largest general store in town, and Eleanor was active in the church and various social organizations. If there had been another young woman living with them, or closely associated with the family, there would be records, church attendance logs, social announcements in the local newspaper, census data." Mrs. Chen explained that the town where the Whitmores had lived was small and close-knit. Everyone knew everyone else's business, social events were reported in the local newspaper, and church records documented not just members, but regular attendees. If a young woman had been living with the Whitmores or even visiting regularly, it would have been noted somewhere. "I've been through all our archives," Mrs. Chen continued. "Church records, newspaper files, town meeting minutes, even personal diaries that have been donated to our collection. There's no mention of anyone matching your description." Mrs. Chen promised to search through the archives more thoroughly, but Margaret wasn't optimistic. If the woman had existed, someone would have remembered her. The town where the Whitmores had lived was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. That night, Margaret found herself unable to sleep. She kept thinking about the photographs, about the woman's face. There was something familiar about her, something that nagged at the edges of Margaret's consciousness like a half-remembered dream. She got up and retrieved the album, carrying it to her kitchen table where the light was better. She made herself a cup of tea and settled in to study each photograph again, paying particular attention to the mysterious woman's features. The woman's face was striking, with high cheekbones and a delicate jawline. Her hair was dark and thick, styled in the elaborate updos that were fashionable in 1912. Her clothing suggested good taste and financial means, but it was her expression that was most intriguing. In some photographs she looked happy and relaxed. In others there was a hint of sadness or uncertainty in her eyes. And then she saw it, the woman's eyes. They were the same shape as Eleanor Whitmore's eyes, the same unusual pale blue color that had been passed down through the family. Margaret had seen those eyes in the mirror every morning of her life. Her own daughter had inherited them, and her granddaughter too. But it wasn't just the eyes. The more Margaret studied the woman's face, the more familial resemblances she found. The shape of her nose was identical to Margaret's grandmother's. Her chin had the same slight cleft that appeared in several family members. Even her hands, visible in some of the photographs, bore the long, slender fingers that were a Whitmore family trait. The resemblances were too strong to be coincidental. This woman was related to them. Margaret was certain of it. But if she was family, why wasn't she in any of their records? Margaret called David immediately, despite the late hour. "I think she's related to us," she said without preamble. "What do you mean?" "The woman in the photographs. She looks like us. She has our features, our family traits. But David, if she was a Whitmore, why isn't she in any of our records?" David was quiet for a long moment. Maybe she died young, before she could be properly documented. But she's in photographs spanning several months, maybe even years, and she doesn't look sick or frail in any of them. They agreed to meet again the next day to examine the photographs with this new perspective. Sarah joined them, and together they created a timeline based on the dated photographs. The mysterious woman first appeared in a photograph from June 1912. She was standing in the background of what appeared to be a graduation celebration for one of the Whitmore daughters. In this first image, she looked uncertain, almost shy. Her dress was simpler than in later photographs, and she stood slightly apart from the main group. The graduation celebration appeared to be for Mary, the eldest daughter, who would have been finishing her education at the local academy. The photograph showed the family gathered on the front lawn, with Mary wearing a white dress and holding what appeared to be a diploma or certificate. But as the months progressed, the mysterious woman became more integrated into the family. By August, she was prominently featured in Thomas's birthday celebration, standing directly behind his chair with her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture that suggested familiarity and affection. By Christmas of that year, she was seated at the head table, wearing what appeared to be an expensive dress and a necklace that matched Eleanor's. The progression was clear when viewed chronologically. The woman had started as an outsider and gradually become an insider. Someone had welcomed her into the family, had given her a place at their table and in their most important moments. The Christmas photograph was particularly revealing. The mysterious woman was seated between Eleanor and Mary, participating in what was clearly a formal family portrait. She was wearing a dress made of rich fabric with intricate beadwork, and her jewelry included not just the matching necklace, but also earrings and a bracelet that appeared to be part of a set. The last photograph featuring her was dated March 1913. She was standing in the garden behind the Whitmore house alone. Unlike the other photographs, where she appeared happy and comfortable, in this final image she looked different, sad, perhaps, or frightened. Her usual confident posture was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like resignation. What happened to her after March 1913? Sarah wondered aloud. Margaret had been thinking the same thing. She decided to research death records from that period, focusing on young women in the area who had died in the spring of 1913. What she found made her blood run cold. There had been a death that spring. A young woman, approximately 22 years old, found in the lake behind the Whitmore property. The newspaper article was brief, stating only that the woman had apparently drowned and that her identity was unknown. She had been buried in the town's potter's field, her grave marked only with a number. But here's what made Margaret's hands shake as she read. The woman had been found wearing a dress that matched exactly the one worn by the mysterious woman in the final photograph. The newspaper description was detailed enough to be certain. A dark blue dress with pearl buttons, a white lace collar, and intricate embroidery around the cuffs. It was distinctive enough that there could be no mistake. The article also mentioned that the woman had been found early in the morning by a local fisherman. She had been floating face down in the shallow water near the shore, her clothing intact and her hair still pinned up in an elaborate style. There were no signs of violence or struggle. Margaret shared this discovery with David and Sarah. They sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications. "So she was real," David said finally. "She lived with our family for almost a year, and then she died. But why is there no record of who she was?" Sarah had a different concern. If she drowned in the lake behind the family property, why didn't any of the Whitmores identify her? Why didn't they claim her body? These were questions that seemed to have no answers. Margaret decided to visit the location where their ancestors had lived. The original Whitmore house was long gone, but the property was still there, now part of a state park. She drove out on a grey Saturday morning, following directions to what had once been the Whitmore homestead. The journey took her through countryside that had changed little since 1912. Rolling hills covered with bare trees, stone walls that marked old property boundaries, and farmhouses that had weathered more than a century of New England seasons. The foundation stones were still visible, overgrown with ivy and moss. Margaret could make out the outline of what had been a substantial house, larger than she had expected. The Whitmores had clearly been prosperous, able to afford a home that would have been impressive even by today's standards. She walked around the foundation, trying to imagine the house as it had been. The front porch where so many of the family photographs had been taken, the parlor where Eleanor had entertained guests, the kitchen where meals had been prepared for the large family. Behind where the house had stood, a trail led down to the lake. It was a beautiful spot, peaceful and serene. Margaret could imagine why the family had chosen to build here. The lake was large enough for swimming and boating, surrounded by woods that would have provided privacy and natural beauty. But as she stood on the shore, looking out over the dark water, she felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. The lake that had once been a source of joy for the family had also been the site of tragedy. She was about to leave when something caught her eye. Partially hidden by overgrown bushes was a small stone marker. Margaret pushed through the vegetation to get a closer look. The marker was old, weathered almost smooth by decades of rain and snow, but she could just make out an inscription. "Unknown girl, 1913. May she find peace." Someone had cared enough to mark the spot where the woman had been found. Someone had wanted her to be remembered, even if her name was lost. The stone was simple but well made, suggesting that whoever had placed it there had spent money they might not have been able to spare. Margaret took photographs of the marker and the surrounding area. As she was preparing to leave, she noticed something else. Carved into a large oak tree near the shore were initials, EW+. The question mark was deliberate, carved with the same careful precision as the letters. E.W. Eleanor Whitmore. But who was the question mark meant to represent? The carving was old, the bark having grown around the edges of the letters over the decades. It had been made around the same time as the mysterious woman's death. Margaret was certain of it. That evening, Margaret called Dr. Harrison again. She wanted to know if there was any way to determine more about the mysterious woman from the photographs themselves. "There might be," Dr. Harrison said thoughtfully. "I could try facial recognition software, compare her features to known family members. It's not perfect with historical photographs, but it might give us some answers." Margaret agreed, and Dr. Harrison promised to run the analysis over the weekend. The results, when they came, were more disturbing than anything they had discovered so far. "I ran the facial recognition software against the confirmed family members in the photographs," Dr. Harrison explained during their phone call. "The mysterious woman shows significant facial similarities to multiple family members. In fact, the software suggests she could be a sister or daughter to Eleanor Whitmore." Margaret felt the room spin slightly. "But that's impossible. Eleanor's children are all accounted for, and she had no sisters." "I know," Dr. Harrison said quietly, "but the software doesn't lie. According to the analysis, this woman is genetically related to your family, very closely related." The facial recognition results showed percentage matches that were impossible to ignore. The mysterious woman shared facial structure markers with Eleanor Whitmore that suggested a parent-child or sibling relationship. She also showed strong similarities to Thomas, though to a lesser degree. "The bone structure is almost identical," Dr. Harrison continued. "The distance between the eyes, the shape of the skull, the proportions of the facial features. This woman is definitely related to your family." After hanging up, Margaret sat in her kitchen staring at the album. She felt as if she was missing something crucial, some piece of information that would make everything fall into place. She decided to call Mrs. Chen at the Historical Society again. Maybe there were records she hadn't thought to check. "I've been thinking about your mystery woman," Mrs. Chen said when Margaret called. "There's one thing I didn't mention before. In 1912 there was a scandal involving the Whitmore family. Nothing serious by today's standards, but significant for that time period." Margaret's pulse quickened. What kind of scandal? Eleanor Whitmore's younger sister had a child out of wedlock. This would have been around 1890 or 1891. The family disowned her and she left town. The child was given up for adoption. Margaret felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to click together. Do you know what happened to the child? No official records. But there were rumors that the child was a girl and that she was raised by a family in a neighboring town. The story goes that she grew up not knowing her true parentage. And she would have been about 22 in 1912, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Exactly. Mrs. Chen went on to explain that such scandals were devastating for families in 1912. Unmarried pregnancy was considered a moral failing that reflected on the entire family. The fact that Eleanor's sister had been disowned suggested that the family had chosen to protect their reputation rather than support their daughter. Margaret thanked Mrs. Chen and hung up. She sat in the growing darkness of her kitchen, the album open before her, and began to construct a theory. What if the mysterious woman was Eleanor's niece? What if she had somehow discovered her true parentage and come to find her birth family? It would explain her gradual integration into the family photographs, her obvious comfort with the Whitmores, and the genetic similarities that the facial recognition software had detected. But it didn't explain why there were no records of her visit, or why the family hadn't identified her body after she drowned. Margaret decided she needed to know more about the circumstances of the woman's death. She contacted the local newspaper that had covered the story in 1913, hoping their archives might contain more detailed information. The elderly archivist, Mr. Brennan, was intrigued by Margaret's request. "We don't get many people asking about stories from 1913, he said with a chuckle, "but I remember that case. It was unusual because the woman was well dressed, obviously from a good family, but no one came forward to claim her." He disappeared into the archives and returned with a folder containing several newspaper clippings. "Here's what we published at the time," he said, spreading the articles on the table. "But there's more to the story. My grandfather was the editor then, and he kept personal notes about cases that interested him." Mr. Brennan produced a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. According to his notes, there were several strange aspects to the case. The woman was found floating in the lake, but there were no signs of struggle. Her clothes were intact, her hair was still pinned up properly. It was as if she had simply walked into the water and disappeared. Margaret studied the newspaper articles. The description of the woman matched the mysterious figure in the photographs perfectly. Height, hair color, approximate age, even details about her clothing and jewelry. "But here's the strangest part," Mr. Brennan continued, reading from his grandfather's journal. "The Whitmore family claimed they had never seen her before. They said she was a complete stranger to them." Margaret looked up sharply. "They denied knowing her." "According to these notes, yes. Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore both stated that they had no idea who the woman was or why she had been found on their property. They suggested she might have been a vagrant who had wandered onto their land." This revelation changed everything. If the Whitmores had denied knowing the woman, then why was she in so many of their family photographs? Why had she been integrated so completely into their family life? Mr. Brennan's grandfather had apparently been suspicious of the family's claims. His notes indicated that he had tried to investigate further, but had been met with resistance from the Whitmores and their friends in the community. "My grandfather wrote that the family seemed nervous when questioned," Mr. Brennan read. He noted that Thomas Whitmore's hands shook when he was asked about the woman, and that Eleanor became agitated and had to leave the room. Margaret left the newspaper office with copies of all the articles, her mind racing with new questions. She called David and Sarah and arranged to meet them that evening. "I think we need to consider the possibility that something terrible happened," Margaret said, after sharing what she had learned. "What if the family did know her, but they had reasons for denying it?" Sarah looked uncomfortable. "What kind of reasons?" "I don't know, but think about it. A young woman appears in their lives, someone who might be family, but whose existence would be scandalous. She lives with them for months, becomes part of their daily life. And then she dies under mysterious circumstances, and they claim they never knew her. David was studying one of the photographs, the final one showing the woman alone in the garden. She looks frightened in this last picture. What if she discovered something? What if she learned something that made her a threat? They spent the evening examining the photographs with new eyes, looking for clues they might have missed. It was Sarah who noticed something that made them all fall silent. In several of the photographs, the mysterious woman was wearing jewelry, a distinctive necklace with a cameo pendant, and a bracelet with an unusual clasp. In the photographs showing Eleanor Whitmore, she was wearing similar pieces. Family jewelry, Sarah said quietly. She was wearing family heirlooms. Margaret felt a chill, which means the family not only knew her, they accepted her. They gave her jewelry that would have been passed down through generations. The implications were staggering. The Whitmores hadn't just known the mysterious woman, they had welcomed her as family. So why had they denied her existence after her death? Margaret decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to identify the woman, she would try to understand what had happened to the family after her death. She researched the Whitmores' history following 1913. What she found was a pattern of tragedy and decline that seemed to begin immediately after the woman's death. In 1914, Thomas Whitmore's business failed. The general store that had been the foundation of the family's prosperity was forced to close when several major creditors called in their debts simultaneously. The family lost their home and moved to a smaller property on the outskirts of town. In 1916, their eldest son died in a farming accident. Thomas Jr. had been helping a neighbor with his harvest when a piece of machinery malfunctioned. He was killed instantly, leaving behind a young wife and 2 small children. 2 years later, Eleanor suffered what was described as a nervous breakdown and was institutionalized for several months. The records Margaret found described her condition as melancholia with episodes of hysteria. She would spend the rest of her life in and out of various sanitariums. By 1920, the once prosperous Whitmore family had scattered. The surviving children moved away, seeking opportunities in distant cities. Thomas and Eleanor lived out their remaining years in relative poverty and isolation, dependent on charity from the church and occasional help from relatives. It was as if the family had been cursed. Margaret shared these findings with David and Sarah. They sat in Margaret's living room, the album open between them, trying to make sense of the pattern. What if her death wasn't an accident? Sarah said quietly. What if someone in the family was responsible, and the guilt destroyed them? It was a terrible thought, but it fit the evidence. The mysterious woman's integration into the family, her access to family jewelry, her sudden death and the family's subsequent denial and decline. David picked up one of the photographs, studying the woman's face. She looked so young, so innocent. What could she have done to deserve? He didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. Margaret made a decision. I want to have her grave properly marked. She deserves to be remembered, even if we never learn her name. The others agreed. They contacted the town's cemetery commission and arranged to have a proper headstone placed at the unmarked grave in the potter's field. The inscription they chose was simple: Unknown Daughter, 1891-1913, beloved and remembered. The day they placed the headstone was grey and cold, with a wind that seemed to carry whispers from the past. As they stood beside the grave, Margaret felt a sense of completion, as if they had finally done something right. But their investigation wasn't over. Margaret had one more idea, one last avenue to explore. She contacted a genealogist who specialized in adoption records and missing family members. Dr. Patricia Vance had helped reunite families and solve genealogical mysteries for over 20 years. When Margaret explained the situation, Dr. Vance was intrigued. Historical adoption cases are challenging, but not impossible. If this woman was indeed related to your family, there might be records we can find. Dr. Vance began her search, focusing on adoption records from the 1890s in the counties surrounding the Whitmore family's hometown. It was painstaking work, requiring her to examine church records, county documents, and private correspondence that had been preserved in various archives. 3 weeks later, she called Margaret with news. I found her, Dr. Vance said, her voice filled with excitement. Her name was Catherine Rose Whitmore. She was born in 1891 to Eleanor Whitmore's sister Mary. The child was given up for adoption to a family named Morrison in the next county. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. After months of mystery, they finally had a name. Catherine Morrison grew up not knowing her true parentage, Dr. Vance continued. But in 1912, when she turned 21, she inherited some papers from her adoptive mother that revealed the truth. That's when she would have sought out the Whitmore family. Everything fell into place. Catherine had discovered her true heritage and had come to find her biological family. The Whitmores had welcomed her, at least initially. She had lived with them for almost a year, becoming part of their daily life. But something had gone wrong. Something had happened that led to her death and the family's subsequent denial of her existence. Margaret asked Dr. Vance to continue her research to see if she could find any more details about Catherine's life or death. What Dr. Vance discovered was heartbreaking. Catherine Morrison had been a schoolteacher in her adoptive town. She was described by those who knew her as intelligent, kind, and eager to find her place in the world. When she learned about her true parentage, she had saved money for months to make the journey to find her biological family. Her letters to friends described her joy at being welcomed by the Whitmores. She wrote about feeling like she finally belonged somewhere, about discovering family traits and characteristics that explained so much about herself. But her final letter, written just days before her death, told a different story. "I have learned something terrible," she wrote to her closest friend, "something that changes everything. I don't know what to do. The family I thought I had found, I fear I have made a dreadful mistake." The letter ended abruptly, with no explanation of what Catherine had discovered. Margaret shared this information with David and Sarah. They were sitting in Margaret's living room again, the album open before them, but now they knew they were looking at Catherine Rose Whitmore, their great-great-aunt, who had been erased from family history. What could she have discovered? Sarah wondered. What could have been so terrible that it led to her death? Margaret had been thinking about this question for days. What if it wasn't what she discovered, but what she represented? The others looked at her questioningly. "Think about it," Margaret continued. Catherine was proof of a family scandal. Her very existence reminded everyone of Mary Whitmore's disgrace. What if someone in the family decided that the past was better left buried? It was a chilling thought, but it made sense. In 1912, family reputation was everything. The presence of Catherine, living proof of a family scandal, might have been seen as a threat to the Whitmore name. David picked up the final photograph of Catherine, the one where she looked frightened and alone. "She knew, didn't she? She realized she wasn't safe." Margaret nodded. "I think she tried to leave. That final photograph was taken in March 1913. She was found in the lake a few days later." They sat in silence, contemplating the tragedy of Catherine's story. A young woman who had finally found her family, only to discover that some secrets were meant to stay buried. But there was one more mystery to solve. Margaret had noticed something in the photographs that she hadn't mentioned to the others. In several of the images, Catherine was standing next to a young man who appeared to be about her age. He wasn't a member of the immediate Whitmore family, but he appeared comfortable and familiar with them. Margaret decided to research this young man as well. Using the same techniques that had helped them identify Catherine, she began looking for clues about his identity. What she found added another layer to the tragedy. The young man was Jonathan Whitmore, Thomas's nephew. He had come to live with the family in 1911 after his parents died in a fire. Like Catherine, he was an orphan who had found refuge with the Whitmores. In the photographs, Jonathan and Catherine often appeared together. In some images, they were clearly comfortable with each other, standing close, sometimes with Jonathan's hand on Catherine's shoulder. In one particularly telling photograph, they were sitting together on the porch swing, their body language suggesting an intimacy that went beyond mere friendship. Margaret realized that Catherine and Jonathan had fallen in love. This revelation cast Catherine's death in an even more sinister light. Not only was she a reminder of family scandal, but she had formed a romantic attachment with another family member. In the rigid social structure of 1912, this would have been seen as doubly inappropriate. Margaret found records showing that Jonathan Whitmore had left the family home abruptly in April 1913, just weeks after Catherine's death. He had moved to California and never returned. He never married, and he died alone in 1967. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. But the picture they formed was heartbreaking. Catherine Rose Whitmore had found her family, found love, and found a place where she belonged. But her very existence threatened the carefully constructed respectability that the Whitmore family had built. Someone had decided that she was a problem that needed to be solved permanently. Margaret, David, and Sarah made a pact. They would ensure that Catherine's story was preserved and told. They would make sure that she was remembered not as an unknown victim, but as a member of their family who deserved love and recognition. They created a memorial page on the family genealogy website, complete with the photographs and Catherine's story. They contacted distant relatives and shared what they had learned. They made sure that Catherine Rose Whitmore would never again be erased from family history. But the album held one final secret, one that Margaret discovered only by accident. She was carefully removing one of the photographs to have it professionally restored when she noticed that there was something written on the back. In faded pencil, almost invisible with age, were the words, "Catherine and Jonathan, May 1912. True love always finds a way." The handwriting was different from Cordelia's careful script. It was more hurried, more emotional. Margaret realized that someone else had been documenting Catherine's story, someone who had cared about her enough to preserve these memories, even when the rest of the family wanted to forget. Margaret showed the inscription to David and Sarah. They studied it carefully, trying to determine who might have written it. It could have been Jonathan, Sarah suggested. Maybe he kept some of the photographs after Catherine died. But Margaret had another theory. What if it was Eleanor? What if she knew what was going to happen to Catherine and tried to preserve some record of her existence? They would never know for certain, but the inscription provided a final piece of evidence that Catherine had been loved, that her time with the family had mattered to someone. As Margaret closed the album for the final time, she reflected on what they had learned. The mysterious woman in the photographs had been Catherine Rose Whitmore, a young teacher who had spent her life searching for her place in the world. She had found love and family, but she had also found danger. Her death remained officially unsolved, but Margaret believed they had uncovered the truth. Catherine had been murdered, either by a family member who saw her as a threat to their reputation or by someone acting on the family's behalf. The subsequent decline of the Whitmore family suggested that guilt and shame had eaten away at them from the inside. They had chosen reputation over family, secrecy over truth, and they had paid a terrible price. But Catherine's story didn't end with her death. Through the photographs she had left behind, through the love that someone had felt for her enough to preserve her memory, she had found a way to be remembered. Margaret placed the album in a place of honor in her home. Visitors would often ask about the photographs, and Margaret would tell them about Catherine Rose Whitmore, the family member who had been lost and found again. Sometimes, late at night, Margaret would take out the album and study Catherine's face. In the early photographs, she looked hopeful and happy. In the later ones, there was a sadness in her eyes, as if she knew what was coming. But in one photograph, the one labeled Catherine and Jonathan, May 1912, she looked radiant. She looked like a young woman who had found everything she had been searching for. Margaret liked to think that in that moment, Catherine had been truly happy, that, for a brief time, she had experienced the love and belonging she had spent her life seeking. The album had revealed its secrets, but it had also taught Margaret something important about family. Blood relationships weren't always enough. Sometimes the people who mattered most were the ones who chose to love you, to remember you, to fight for your story, even when others wanted it forgotten. Catherine Rose Whitmore had been erased from family history once, but she would never be forgotten again. Her face would continue to look out from those old photographs, a reminder that every person has a story worth telling, a life worth remembering. And sometimes, if you look carefully at old family photographs, you might find faces that seem familiar, but don't quite belong. People who were loved and lost, remembered and forgotten, but who somehow found a way to remain part of the family story. Because the dead don't always stay buried. Sometimes they find their way back through the very photographs that were meant to preserve the memories of the living. Margaret never found out exactly what happened to Catherine Rose Whitmore on that March day in 1913. But she knew that Catherine's story had finally been told, that her existence had been acknowledged, and that she had found her way back to the family that had once tried to erase her. In the end, that was perhaps the most important discovery of all. that love and memory are stronger than shame and secrecy, that truth has a way of surfacing even after more than a century of silence, and that sometimes the faces in old photographs are trying to tell us something. We just have to be willing to listen. The Whitmore family album sits in Margaret's living room now, a testament to the power of persistence and the importance of remembering those who have been forgotten. Catherine's face looks out from those sepia-toned pages, no longer a mystery, but a beloved family member who has finally come home. Her story serves as a reminder that every family has secrets, but that some secrets are meant to be uncovered. That justice can come in many forms, and sometimes the most important justice is simply being remembered. Catherine Rose Whitmore lived, loved, and died more than a century ago, but through the photographs she left behind and the determination of family members who refused to let her be forgotten, she found her way back to where she belonged. In the end, that's all any of us can hope for: to be remembered, to be loved, to have our stories told, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, to find our way home. But Margaret's investigation didn't end with Catherine's identification. As word spread through the extended family about their discovery, other relatives began coming forward with their own mysterious photographs and unexplained family stories. Margaret's cousin Robert, who lived in Vermont, called to say he had found similar anomalies in his collection of family photographs. A man who appeared in several images from the 1920s, but couldn't be identified by any living relative. The man appeared to be in his 30s, well-dressed and comfortable with the family, but there was no record of who he might have been. Margaret's great-niece in Oregon discovered a woman in her grandmother's wedding photos who seemed to be part of the family but had no corresponding documentation. The woman was standing with the immediate family in formal portraits, wearing expensive clothing and jewelry that suggested she was more than just a friend or neighbor. It was as if Catherine's story had opened a door, revealing a pattern of erased family members that stretched across generations. People who had been deliberately forgotten, their stories buried along with whatever secrets they represented. Margaret began to wonder if the Whitmore family had a history of making inconvenient relatives disappear from the official record. Were there others like Catherine, people whose existence had been deemed too dangerous or embarrassing to acknowledge? She decided to expand her research, looking for gaps in the family genealogy that might represent other missing persons. What she found was disturbing. There were indeed gaps, periods where family records seemed incomplete, where the number of children listed in census data didn't match the number of graves in family plots. Missing years in family correspondence, as if certain time periods had been deliberately obscured. In the 1890s, there was a gap in the family records that corresponded to the time when Eleanor's sister Mary would have been pregnant with Catherine. But there were other gaps too. In the 1870s, a period of several years where no family letters or documents survived. In the 1920s, a time when several family members seemed to have simply vanished from all records. Margaret realized that Catherine might not have been the first family member to be erased from history. She might have been part of a pattern, a tradition of silencing those who threatened the family's carefully constructed image. The more Margaret researched, the more she understood that the Whitmore family had been hiding secrets for generations. Catherine's murder might have been the culmination of a long history of choosing reputation over truth, image over family. But Catherine had found a way to survive. Through the photographs that someone had carefully preserved, through the love that had been documented in those images, she had outlasted those who had tried to erase her. Her story had finally been told, her existence finally acknowledged, and in doing so she had opened the door for other forgotten family members to be remembered as well. Margaret knew that her work was far from over. There were other mysteries to solve, other stories to uncover, but Catherine had shown her the way, had proven that even the most carefully buried secrets could eventually come to light. As Margaret looked at Catherine's photograph one last time, she made a promise. She would continue to search for the forgotten members of her family. She would make sure that their stories were told, their lives remembered, because everyone deserves to be remembered. Everyone deserves to have their story told. And sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that someone tried very hard to hide. The investigation into Catherine's death had revealed more than just the truth about one young woman's tragic fate. It had exposed a family pattern of secrecy and erasure that had persisted for generations. Margaret realized that the Whitmores had been systematically removing inconvenient family members from their official history, creating a sanitized version of their past that protected their reputation at the cost of truth. But photographs, Margaret had learned, were harder to erase than documents. They captured moments that couldn't be easily forgotten or explained away. And sometimes, if you looked carefully enough, those moments could reveal secrets that had been buried for more than a century. Catherine Rose Whitmore had finally found her way home. Her story had been told, her existence acknowledged, her memory preserved. She would never again be the mysterious face in old photographs, the woman who had never existed. She was family, she was loved, she was remembered. And that, Margaret thought, was perhaps the most important discovery of all.